Welcome to Train Signal. You are watching Administering SRM. Welcome to this lesson on the administration of SRM. I think you'll like the content. In this lesson, we'll focus on the skills you'll need to adjust your SRM setup to respond to the inevitable changes in your environment, as well as help you with the day-to-day activities you may be required to handle as part of an administrator for an SRM environment. In this lesson, you'll learn how to administer protection groups and protected VMs. We'll also cover protected data store administration and how to add new protected data stores to expand capacity. We'll show you how you can adjust inventory mappings and troubleshoot issues related to incomplete mappings caused by folks changing of resources on the protected or recovery sites. We'll also create and manage SRM alarms. We'll cover how to configure access control and get into some of the best practice on this security topic. We'll overview SRM logging, and we'll finish with a quick demo on recovery plan reporting. This is an important lesson to help you keep the lights on your shiny new SRM installation. So let's get ready and let's hit it. Okay, now let's discuss protection group administration. There is one constant in life and in IT, and that is change. Setting up an SRM environment is not a one and done proposition. The system will need to be continually tweaked and improved based on the lessons learned from the DR tests that you're doing to refine your SRM configuration. And you'll also have changes as you add protected VMs or as you change settings within your protected environment. This lesson will help the SRM administrator respond to those changes. And we're going to focus first, though, on the administration of the protection group. Now, changes to the protection group start with storage. That's the key piece to take away with protection groups in general, right? They're created on top of replicated VMware data stores. So what this means is a lot of protection group administration is going to focus on the data store level, and you'll just need to be aware of that. There's going to be three major options for how you can add or remove protection from virtual machines, which we'll discuss. Deploy from template or creating a new virtual machine on a protected data store is one of the common ways that you can add protection to a VM. Once you're done with that, you would then configure protection on the new VM, which will show you the distinction between that and just placing the VM on the data store. The other way that you can change a protection group or add, subtract VMs is to use storage vMotion or cold migration to move the storage of a virtual machine from a protected data store to an unprotected data store. Once you're done with that, you would then remove protection from the virtual machine. The third option is to storage vMotion or cold migrate a virtual machine from a protected data store into maybe possibly another protected data store. That would be one way to maybe shuffle things around. In that instance, it would get a little difficult, or not a little difficult, but a little hybridized in how you would respond to that. So when you move the VM from a protected data store, you would then need to remove protection on it so that the shadow VMs at the recovery site aren't reflecting that that VM lives in a certain data store that it doesn't any longer. So once you've removed the protection, you would then need to go into the new protection group that's servicing that replicated data store, and then you would need to add protection back in onto that virtual machine. I'll show you that in a demo in just a second, though. After moving to new storage or creating new replicated volumes, you'll need to make sure that you configure or remove protection on the affected virtual machines. And we've hinted at that a little bit in the above options for administering protection groups. It'll really make sense as we go in and demonstrate that. So let's go ahead and do that without further ado. I say it's demo time. Okay, now we're ready to begin the demonstration for how you would go about administering the protection group and doing some of the common activities associated with it. As you can see, I'm logged into the protected site here. How do we know that? Well, if we go to the Site Recovery tab, look at Local Site, sure enough, it says Protected Site. If I go through down to Protection Groups, I can see where we have some warnings. Well, earlier we were talking about adding and removing virtual machines from protection. Well, in the case of these warnings, it's because we've added some virtual machines to a protected data store, which was in this case VMFS1 was the name of it. Well, since there was already some virtual machines protected, they're fine, but SRM immediately sees that there's other virtual machines on that volume that haven't gone through the configure protection step. This will basically come down to making sure that they're using the exact same inventory mappings that the other VMs are, and that there's nothing out of the ordinary. There's a couple options here. We could configure all, which I think would be the route to go. Otherwise, we can also do configure protection, which would configure each VM individually. I don't really like that idea because I'd like to see all the virtual machines within a protection group configured identically. Testbox 4, however, is a test box. It has been added into this data store by mistake, so I'm not sure if I want to configure protection for it. However, I'm going to need to remove it from that data store in order to take the protection away. So let's do that first before we configure protection on critical PC. So I go back to home screen, I'll take a look at my inventory, and we'll see we've got a couple of test box here. Test box 4 and test box 3, both of them on VMFS1. I'm going to actually move them. Change the data store that they're located on. Leave them in the test resource pool. I would put them on local storage since I don't really need them. I don't want them to be protected, taking up all that space. And since this is a pretty small virtual machine, this should not take long at all. It's completed. Test box 3 also shows that it's on that data store. We're going to delete it and get rid of it. This test box no longer needed it. I talked to the business owner. They're fine. Okay, well now that we've removed that virtual machine from the protection group to clean up the protection, it's time to configure protection on critical PC2 so that it can be protected along with the other virtual machines. To do that, we'll simply just click on that virtual machine. I like to use the configure all so that all virtual machines get the same settings for recovery. Are you sure you want to continue? Of course. So click the yes. Great. And now we've configured protection on critical PC2. If we were to switch over to the recovery site, you would then be able to see that there's some new this is the recovery site, and you'll see that I now have 3 shadow VMs created in a DR resource pool, which is the resource pool that I have all of my all of my protected virtual machines pointed to within that group. So that's how you configure protection on virtual machines added into a protection group. But since we've walked through the steps of setting up a new protected data store, I'd like to show you how you can then scan for that data store and create a new protection group for the virtual machines to be stored on that new protected data store. We'll do that in just a second. Administering protected data stores is an important task that you'll likely need to master, since your first replicated data stores probably won't have infinite capacity. You'll likely need to add data stores over time, or replace data stores in the case of a storage migration to a new storage vendor or additional array within your environment. This section will review the common tasks that you'll need to know in order to do that. First, we start with adding storage capacity for SRM. And adding storage capacity for SRM involves creating new replicated SAN volumes and adding them into the ESX server so they can see them, and then adding to SRM through the Array Manager configuration. I'll demonstrate that in just a second. But you might have reached capacity on your storage device. In that case, you may have to add a second storage array, and quite possibly from a different vendor. As long as the array vendor is on VMware's compatibility matrix for SRM, you'll be good to go. But in addition to the steps above, don't forget to install the new SRA for the new SAN. Remember that the SRA is the storage replication adapter. It's what talks to the storage array from SRM. So without that new SRA that the new SAN would require, there's no way you're going to configure it with SRM. So if you refer back to our lesson installing SRM, you'll have the information you need to complete that step. Also, when getting started, it is common to promote an existing replicated data store in your environment to the protected status. As long as there are virtual machines on it, there won't be a problem with doing this, since you'll need virtual machines on a data store in order for SRM to see it when it gets scanned. But not all virtual machines on this existing data store would probably need protection. You might have production workloads mixed with test and dev. In that case, you'll need to use storage vMotion or cold migration to move the virtual machines off that protected data store and onto a less critical either local data store or just a data store that's not being replicated. You would also need to then configure protection on the virtual machines that you left on that newly protected data store. If the new VMs use resources that currently aren't mapped by the inventory mapping of SRM, you might also have to update those relationships prior to configuring protection. In the following demo, I'll show you how you can add capacity for the new protected virtual machines. To do this, we'll create some new replicated SAN volumes on the storage that we have set up in our lab, and we'll configure replication on those volumes so that SRM would recognize them as something that can be protected. We'll then present that storage to the ESX servers and configure them for production use. Finally, we'll add the protected data stores into SRM through the Array Manager configuration and allow the Array Manager to rescan that storage device to look for replicated volumes. One key piece of note here, we need to make sure that there's one virtual machine on that new data store, otherwise SRM won't be able to detect it. So an additional step here would be to create a virtual machine or move a virtual machine to the new volume. Are you ready? Well, let's get started with adding capacity for our SRM setup. First step we're going to do here is we're going to pretend that we've run out of protected space on our SRM setup. We now need to add a new replicated volume to serve as a data store that could be protected and store protected virtual machines. To accomplish this, we'll need to create a new replicated volume on our protected storage system. So if you remember back, we use HP left-hand VSA, or Virtual SAN Appliance, for this lesson. I'm going to go into the protected side. I have a protected cluster and a recovery cluster. I'm going to go under volumes and create new volume. We'll call this guy VMFS 2 because I'm very creative in my naming capacities. And we'll give it a size of 40 gig. Since I don't have much actual disk space, I like to use thin provisioning. So I'll use thin provisioning so that we can get a larger LUN on less space. Once that's done, we'll go ahead and click OK. Could assign servers here. We'll click OK. There's no assigned server, so we'll go ahead and say new server, which I could enter in a brand new server. What's easier for me within the left-hand setup here is to actually go to servers. Click on the protected ESX1 that we have out here. I can assign a volume to that server by simply clicking the checkbox for VMFS2. That's the easiest way. Great, now that we have the volume, we need to configure replication on it so that it can be seen by SRM. To do that, we'll right-click on this and say New Scheduled Remote Snapshot of Volume, or Replication. We'll select a start time so that this can begin replicating. 9:04 works for me. We'll have it follow a similar schedule as our other volume does, and that's 30 minutes. We'll then also retain these snapshots for a maximum of 3. It's pretty easy. The remote snapshot group, however, we need to click Recovery Group. And click on New Remote Volume. We'll add this new remote volume to the existing cluster. Recovery cluster selected. We'll call it Replica of VMFS 2. Click Finish. Then we'll just need to set the retention policy, which will do 3 snapshots as well. Once all that is done, we can go ahead and click OK. We've now created a replicated SAN volume. And once that, it's already triggered. It's replicating the metadata of the volume right now, since there's no actual data on this volume. So now we have two volumes with replication established. The first already has 3 snapshots. The second just has this one first initial snapshot. So that's great. We've created the volume, we set up replication, we've assigned it to a server. Now we need to go back into vSphere client and make sure that the ESX servers can see it. All right, here we are logged into the vSphere client to the protected site. To add this iSCSI volume into the protected site's ESX server, you'll click the ESX server. We'll go to configuration, and under the make sure that the iSCSI software adapter is selected. We'll do a rescan. Click OK to begin that process. Great, we've now see 2 volumes where before we only saw 1. So since this is a brand new volume, we'll need to quickly go in and create a VMFS data store on that new volume. To do that, we click Add Storage under the Storage section. Disk and LUN. There's only 1 volume that's left there, so I'll select it. Excuse me, that's only 1 unformatted volume. So we select our volume and then we'll give it a name, VMFS 2. Then click Next. We'll just select the defaults for now. And at the end of this, we should see that we have a VMFS volume that can now be used to store protected virtual machines. Great, VMFS 2. But before it can be used by SRM, we'll need to create a virtual machine to live on it. To do that, I'll just take this little test box, which is a very small, lightweight DOS virtual machine that VMware can provide through the Virtual Appliance Marketplace. It's called Nostalgia, if you're looking for it. Anyway, I'm going to clone that virtual machine into test machine number, give it 6 to make sure that we're completely unique here. And then go ahead and click next. Choose where it should live. This is all old hat for you VI masters out here, but right here we need to make sure we select VMFS2. So in your scenario, if you're adding a brand new replicated volume, you would actually choose probably a mission critical virtual machine to move to this new data store so that you could then protect it with SRM. In my case, I'm just throwing something simple on it so that it can be seen by SRM and can be scanned for the demonstration. So I'll go ahead and click next and choose thin provisioning because I like it. Then click next and finish. Once this is done cloning, we'll then have a virtual machine living on that protected data store that we could then use to trigger the SRM scanning process or make the SRM scanning process aware that there's a virtual machine on that can be protected. Okay, we've added that replicated data store and we've created a virtual machine on that data store so that it can be sensed by the SRM configuration wizard. We're now ready to add this data store into SRM so that it's available to create a protection group on it. To do that, we log into the site recovery plugin on the protected site. As you can see, we're here in the protected site. This configuration will be done through the Array Manager section. So I'll go ahead and click Configure under Array Managers. If you're paying attention very closely, you'll note that the device count down here is now 2. We only started out with there being 1 data store being in use, which I can explain that in that I've already done this scanning, so to speak, with the new volume. I just didn't want to recreate the lab to record this lesson. So pretend that this is 1 for now, and I'll walk through the exact same steps that you would need to do to have that newly added data store show up for SRM. You shouldn't have to do anything up here if that new data store was added to an existing stand. So we'll go ahead and click next at the screen. Same for the recovery site array managers. We're not adding anything new. All we want to do is rescan the available array managers to see for new replicated volumes. Again, this says 2, pretend it says 1. Thank you. I'll click next here. And in the event that this was done for the first time, you wouldn't see VMFS2. And you'd only see VMFS1. So what we needed to do to have that show up was click Rescan Arrays down in the lower right-hand corner. And click Yes to continue. After a few short moments, it would report all the data store groups that it could see that are 1, connected to the array managers we've added, and 2, have replication configured within the SAN itself, and also as a third option, they have a virtual machine stored on them. Otherwise, they won't be seen in this step. And I'll expand these so that you can get an idea, but device 1 is VMFS1, device 2, VMFS2, and they're both replicated. So I'll click Finish. We have now added the new replicated data store so that we have additional capacity in which to protect virtual machines. And we've also added a virtual machine onto that new protected data store. So now we're ready to create a second protection group on top of that newly created data store. To do that, under Protection Groups, we'll go ahead and click Create. This protection group we'll probably call Protection Group VMFS2. I click Next. In this data store group section, you can see that the VMFS1 data store is grayed out. That's because it's already assigned to another protection group. So what I can do is select the only data store group I have available, which is VMFS2, which should not be confused with VMFS version 2, as in the file system. This is just a name I chose so that you could understand it was a VMFS data store. Anyway, once that's collected, go ahead and click Next and fill out the location for where you'd like to see placeholder VMs stored. I'm going to choose the Shadow VMs VMFS data store and click Next. Great, now I have 2 protection groups created. And I've also added protection to test machine 6, which was that test machine that we created earlier, or that virtual machine that we moved onto that newly created data store. To show you what that looks like, I'll quickly shift over to recovery VC. And as you can see under dev and test, we now have test machine 6. Let's shift back for just a second, because inside of protection group, yep, that's right, we have protection configured. And to double check how we had that configured, I'm just going to go ahead and edit this group for a second. Very good. Shadow VMs. So pretty simple stuff. We've created that protection group for VMFS2. We've now showed you all the steps that you need to do to create a new replicated data store, to present that to the ESX servers, add a virtual machine to it so it can be seen by SRM, and we also did a rescan of the data source through the SRM configure array manager section. And finally, we created a protection group specifically for that new data store. So now you can add virtual machines to that data store and protect more virtual machines with SRM. All right, let's dive a little deeper on inventory mappings. If you remember, inventory mappings establish recovery site defaults for folders, networks, and resource pools. That is, they map resources that VMs use at the protected site to the resources that they'll need to use when they're recovered at the recovery site. A couple things to think about here is that if you create additional resources at the protected site, they won't necessarily mess up the recovery plan for virtual machines, since the placeholder VMs would have already been created for protected virtual machines. And it is the placeholder VM's configuration that defines how a protected virtual machine will be recovered at the recovery site. As long as the recovery site resources haven't changed in any way, you are okay with the VMs being recovered the same as the placeholder VMs. However, there is an issue if you have new protected VMs that leverage unmapped inventory. And actually, I should say that's new VMs that you would like to protect. If they are assigned to a resource pool or a new network port group that hasn't been assigned through the inventory mappings, you will not be able to protect them until those inventory resources get assigned to the recovery site counterparts. And I'll demonstrate that later in the following demo. Also, real problems will occur if the recovery site inventory changes and the placeholder VMs get out of sync. That is, the placeholder VMs are pointing to some recovery site resources that maybe no longer exist or have been swapped out for other resources. In this case, you have a couple of options to fix the situation. One is that you may need to just edit the placeholder VMs to reflect the changes that have happened at the recovery site. This is just as simple as doing edit settings on the placeholder VM itself and changing it to an available network or possibly resource pool. My preferred method for now is to remove protection on all the VMs in a protection group and do a configure all for VMs in the group after you have updated the inventory mappings for the new recovery site resources. In this way, you can be sure that a large group of virtual machines gets the identical configuration that they need based on the mappings. It's a little easier to to preserve good change control using this method rather than manually changing a bunch of virtual machines and opening up the possibility for some issues for people not getting it right. An exercise to possibly explore here to make this a little easier, if you say if you have a protected group with dozens of virtual machines, going through each one individually might be kind of a laborious duty. So creating a PowerShell script to go through and update the protection automatically might be something to explore, especially if you do it quite often. Well, that's enough PowerPoint for this section. Let's go ahead and show you how it's done, how you can go in and administer the changes to inventory mappings. Okay, now we're going to show you how you can administer inventory mappings after they've been changed as well. And actually, inventory mappings don't change necessarily, but new resource groups, new folders, resource pools, all these things get created at the protected site, which may or may not require you to then create inventory mappings to reflect that change. Same with the recovery site. You could have new VLANs added, old VLANs deleted, which changes the network port groups that the virtual machines are assigned to during the recovery. So what I'll show you what we've done here is going into hosts and clusters view real quick. I've gone and added a couple resource pools, SETI for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence program. So you can run your SETI servers in there. And I think game servers is also a new resource pool that I've added. Inside networking, I've also added a couple new port groups. I've added game VLAN and SETI virtual machine port group. So this could be something that could happen in any one of your sites. So what I'll need to do is then go into Site Recovery plugin on the protected site, and I'm going to find my inventory mapping section. So to do that, under Inventory Mappings, I'll click Configure. Lots of yellow question marks. So it's SRM has gone out and actually discovered that there's some resources that don't seem to match up, or it doesn't know where to put them. So if we had protected virtual machines assigned to any of these resources, we would also see an issue within their configuration of their protection group. Right now you can see that they're all okay. But let's go ahead and edit one of the virtual machines. Let's do critical PC 2. And under critical PC 2, instead of it being plugged into its normal virtual machine group, I'm going to edit settings here. And under network, I'm going to actually assign it to the SETI network label, and then click OK. 100% complete. Okay, what this should have done, and we'll see in just a second, going into Site Recovery Manager, critical PC 2 is part of this protection group. Interesting. So you can see here that under critical PC 2, it thinks it's going to be going to the DR network, which is certainly the case. But if I was to remove protection for this guy, and I've quickly done that, you'll notice that I have an issue. Now I probably wouldn't have had a problem with that virtual machine. The recovery probably would have worked just fine because I would have wanted it to be restored to that DR network. However, any new virtual machines that happen to belong to those resource pools and you would like to configure protection on them, you're going to have this same issue here, which says mapping missing. So before we can correct the protection on this critical PC2 virtual machine, I'm going to have to edit those inventory mappings so that SRM knows automatically what to do when protection is configured on certain virtual machines. So to do that, go back up to the home tree here, so I know where I'm going, and then I'll go to Inventory Mappings and Configure. This is a pretty easy, straightforward thing, as you remember when we first set these up. But just click on the resources that aren't configured, and then click Configure. In this case, I just want to map the SETI network to the VM network, and click OK. Excuse me, the game VLAN network. And we'll do SETI next. SETI, we'll map that to DR because we have to have disaster recovery for the SETI network. I'm just kidding. That's dry humor on Sean's part. Game servers, game server resource pool. We'll then configure and put that in dev test. That's not terribly important. SETI resource pool. Again, high importance DR resource pool. One last thing, we have a folder on the protected site to organize protected virtual machines. We'll configure that to the recovery site. We don't have any folders on that side yet, so we'll just use the default folder, so to speak, at the data center level and use recovery site data center object. Very good. We have now corrected the inventory mappings so that they look correct, but we still have an issue with our protection group. Now the status has changed from mapping missing to not configured. Let's configure that now. I'll click Configure All, and yes. And just like that, we have now configured protection once we have corrected the inventory mappings. So that's about all you can really do with inventory mappings. It's a pretty straightforward and simple thing to configure. Although it's really good to understand if they're not configured, what are some of the other effects of that? And we got a chance to see that with the critical PC to virtual machine not being configured or having the mapping missing. But again, that was only because we removed protection from it and then tried to re-add protection. Changing of the inventory mappings to any VMs that are part of an existing protection group won't necessarily affect their ability to be recovered, since the placeholder VMs have already been created, sometimes with the correct information. However, if the inventory mappings that were used to create that placeholder VM were possibly pointing to a resource that's no longer at the recovery group, then we could have a few issues. Let's explore that now and see exactly what that would look like if, for instance, one of the resource pools was missing at the recovery site. Okay, so I've gone in and made a few changes on the recovery site to mess up the resources of the virtual machines, of the placeholder virtual machines and what they're pointed to. So basically, placeholder virtual machines take their marching orders from the inventory mappings that we have established already. What you can see here is that we have networks being pointed to the VM network and the DR network over at the recovery site. And there's really no notification that these have changed. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the recovery site looks like. Over here at the recovery site, let's take a look at the recovery ESX server and the configuration of the network. Oh my, I don't see a DR network and I don't see a VM network. Someone has been over here messing things up. And there's now a recovery network and a test network. So I imagine the recovery network would map closely to the DR network, and the test network would be reserved for test VMs only. So what did that do to the placeholder virtual machines? Well, the placeholder virtual machines still are expecting VM network, and in the case of critical PC and all of these in the DR pool, they're all looking for the DR network, which no longer exists. Well, we have two options here. How can we fix this? Well, we could manually edit these placeholder virtual machines by edit settings, choosing the appropriate network. However, that would mean me touching each of the PCs, which I don't like to do. Earlier I talked about a best practice I like to observe when designing my protection groups, and that is trying to, as much as possible, keep every single virtual machine within a protection group pointed to similar recovery resources. So one thing that I have in my mind is that everything going to the DR resource pool, which happened to be the first protection group we set up, I want that entire protection group going to the exact same stuff. I don't want to change that. So I think the easiest way for me to modify all these virtual machines at one shot would be to go back and remove protection and then reconfigure the protection, which should happen very simply. So let's do that. Okay, so we're back here at the protected site. And since we are bouncing around, it'd be good that I just check and do that sanity check thing. Yep, local site here says protected site. I know I'm in the right spot. So where do we go? First off, we have new resources and new mappings. I'm going to want to set up the mappings so that they're correct. So to do that, I'm going to check game VLAN and do configure. And recovery network. Kind of a little bug there. We still see the DR network, even though we just verified that it no longer exists. I'm going to check recovery network and move down. Everywhere I see DR network, I'm going to configure. Change that to recovery. Great, that's pretty easy. Now, I don't think I did not see any difference in resource pools when I was over there. And I know I didn't because I didn't reconfigure them. So what I'm going to do now, which will be the easiest way to go, is I'm going to remove protection on my virtual machines. Which shouldn't take too long. Maybe I can select more than one. Nope. By doing this, I can then do a configure all on the virtual machines. And if I have my inventory mappings correct, they should all get the correct network setting at the recovery site without any manual intervention. So I'm going to go ahead and click configure all, and yes. Successful. Good deal. Let's see what that looks like. So over in the DR pool is those virtual machines that are the placeholders. And just as we wanted, their network is all now corrected and pointed to the recovery network. We do have one that's messed up here, which is under that other protection group. We'll go ahead and change that out too. And I'll remove protection on this guy. I'm sure I want to do that. Shouldn't take too long. All that's going to do is remove the placeholder VM at the recovery site. Which, if you're not familiar, let's go ahead and take a look at just so you can see what the effect of the. Yep, here at the recovery site, there was a virtual machine here under dev test, a placeholder virtual machine. It's no longer. The effect of removing protection on a VM removes its placeholder from the SRM recovery site. So we'll go ahead and click on this guy and actually do configure all now that we know that we got the mappings configured properly. And once this guy's configured, we should be able to see that it's pointed to the DR network. And there's a placeholder VM created for him over at the recovery site. Yep, just like I said, test machine 6 is back. It's in the dev test pool, just as the inventory mappings pointed it to, and it's getting the recovery network. So all is good and well at the recovery site for the placeholders, at least once we corrected our inventory mappings. So you got to see two sides of the equation there. You got to see what happens if inventory mappings are not corrected to reflect new resources added to the protected site. And you also got to see the effect on a protection group in that case too, at least if you created a new virtual machine that used those resources. It was a matter of you configuring the inventory mappings prior to configuring protection. And just as we showed you now, you can also have inventory mappings go to resources at the recovery site that can change or get updated over time, which can possibly invalidate your recovery plans. What we were able to do was identify that and correct the inventory mappings and remap the protection groups by removing protection from them and then re-adding the protection group to, re-adding protection to the virtual machines that were part of those protected data stores. That was a lot to cover, and that about does it here though for inventory mappings. SRM alarms are a key tool in the SRM Administrator's tool belt. There are dozens of alarm events that you can use to better administer the SRM system and stay alerted to key events. These alarms help you maintain a good, known, tested state of your SRM configuration at all times. See, there is a large danger with SRM, and that it's a disaster recovery product. So it might not get the daily attention it needs until test time or until the actual disaster recovery itself. And at that time, it is critical that the software and your configuration are ready to work. So staying on top of any changes to the configuration is crucial to preventing any surprises when your businesses need it most. We'll cover what you need to know to leverage these alarms in your environment in the rest of this lesson. See, SRM alarms can be configured to send an email notification or trigger some other action. But none of the SRM alarms are configured by default to take any action. So if you need them to take a specific action, you'll need to configure that yourself. The options are email to be sent to specific people. Best practice, as many of you know, is to create an alias that could possibly be routed to multiple people, or in the case of someone getting hit by a bus or moving on to new employment, it's good to have that alias set up so that we don't have to change the specific system's email in to the administrators. The second is a notification trap, or an SMP trap. This can be used to notify tools like HP OpenView or other monitoring software that centralize your monitoring of your systems. And finally, a custom script can be used as well to take action when a certain event happens. This is kind of interesting in that SRM is an automation product, and we would layer automation on top of that with the scripts. Very, very unique option there in that anything you can dream up with a script could be thrown on top of VMware's SRM. So it's also good that you know if you require email notification that you'll need to make sure you have that set up within vCenter. And most of you probably have that set up anyway so that you can take advantage of vCenter's other alerts that you have. So let me show you how we can use this simple but very effective tool. All right, here, let's take a look at the Site Recovery Manager Alarms feature. Right now we're logged into the the protected site, which is under the local site here. And to access alarms, we'll simply go to the Alarms tab, where we're presented with quite a few different versions of the alarms that are possible with SRM. Some of my favorites are the remote site down, because this can be used to let you know when the remote site recovery manager is down. And then consequently, you'd want to probably use the up as well, so that if you're getting notified that it's down and it goes right back up in 5 minutes, it's nice to get that notification on the BlackBerry so that you don't hop in your car to go into the office and then only to find out, hey, it was up, 10 minutes ago. So you wasted a trip. Although who drives into the office anymore nowadays anyway? They'll just fire it up on their laptop as far as VPN and go in and do it. But I digress. So let's look at this actually. Let's edit the settings on this alarm, and you'll see that it's a very simple options. We have the description of what it does and the actions. Like we noticed, or like we said earlier, there is no action set up by default. You'll need to add those yourself. So to do that, we'll click on Add, and we have a drop-down box that we can choose one of the three types. Run a script, send a notification trap, send an email. I'm going to go ahead and send an email. Any email in here would work. As long as this is set up through Virtual Center, then you're good to go. See that it was saved. Item of note, if you go into the the administration settings and vCenter server settings, this is where you'll find how to set up mail for your site. I don't have it set up in my environment because I don't have a mail server, but you would simply enter in the address to your SMTP server and the account that you'd like to have notifications sent from. Usually people use something like vCenter or VMware admin, whatever. There is no allowance for mail authentication at this time, so you'll need to work with your mail server administrators to allow for email from the vCenter IP address. Another one of my favorite alarms is the VM added alarm. And that simply allows you to get notified when a VM has been added into a protection group and is ready to be configured for protection. So how does a VM get added to a protection group? If you remember from earlier in the lesson, we actually talked about VMs getting storage vMotion, cold migrated, or possibly deployed from template or a brand new VM created on a replicated data store that's under protection. So just by that simple fact of moving a virtual machine into the replicated volume means it's ready to be configured for protection. I like to get notified this because one, it's something I might know about, and it's just a nice reminder to say, oh yeah, I need to go on and remember to configure protection on that virtual machine. Or it's also a great cue so that we can find out that the VM deployment team or some other team that I'm not aware of has accidentally deployed a virtual machine to a replicated data store and it shouldn't be there. So if I don't know anything about this virtual machine, it's nice to get that email so I can go in and let them know, hey, wrong spot, guys, you need to move it. And these are all good ways to get these notifications in advance so that you can keep your SRM configuration up to date and ready to perform when needed. Like we mentioned earlier, there's dozens of these alarms. We could go into each one in excruciating detail, but we'll leave that to you since it is very simple, and the type of alarms you're going to actually need in your environment are really going to be a function of the amount of staff you have and the complexity and really what you're trying to achieve. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll get back to you at the next section. Okay, now it's time to discuss configuring access control for SRM. As any good administrator knows, security needs to be baked into the system from the very beginning and not added later as an afterthought. A good analogy I like to share with customers or users is that of baking chocolate chip cookies. If you can include the chocolate chips to the batter prior to baking, the cookies taste a lot better and they're a lot easier to make than if you were to try to take chocolate chips and push them into the cookies after they've baked. It's messy and it's a lot of work and doesn't turn out quite right. Anyway, but I digress. SRM offers some additional security roles and permissions to layer on top of vSphere that administrators can use to provide just enough access to the users that need access to SRM. A good thing to note here, though, is that SRM user rights are not enough. You also need at least some vCenter permissions to even log into vCenter, as well as some additional permissions to administer vSphere inventory items as part of your SRM administration duties. For example, if it's the case of changed inventory mappings at the recovery site, it may be necessary to have the privilege to edit the settings on the placeholder VMs so that the recovery VMs will come up to the appropriate network that was changed for whatever reason. How granular you need to go, however, really depends on the size and level of security within your IT organization. In general, if you have a small org, having a right-sized amount of security is the preferred way to go, and not overcomplicating security, because you usually have reduced staff, and if someone's on vacation or leaves the company or, God forbid, gets hit by a bus, if it's a simpler, more straightforward security system, there's a better chance that the remaining IT staff can provide availability in the event of a disaster. And it's easier for consultants to come in to assist your organization. But again, it all depends on the level of security that you need at your organization. Some ideas for some common sense granularity of permissions might be that of creating some specific recovery plans that map to specific IT functional groups or application groups. A good example would be that of an Exchange mail system or a database server system with many different servers and databases or file servers. Enterprise applications that are critical to your organization are a key candidate for protection with SRM, and therefore possibly encapsulating all their servers within a single recovery plan would be a wise way to go. And mapping recovery plans to functional groups like this, it's just a great way to bake security into the SRM installation during the design up front. In many cases, if you can map recovery plans to a functional group, let's say the Exchange mail server administration group, probably already has their own Active Directory groups assigned to their group so that they can more easily assign the SRM roles to those existing groups already. So it's a lot easier in that regard. It also takes away the mess of having to carve up a large recovery plan that has many different functional groups and having to somehow map individual security to individual virtual machines. It's not very easy. So this is probably the route that most companies go. And speaking of security, have you talked with your security guy recently or your security team? This is a great opportunity to include them in your SRM design. Contrary to popular belief, the security team or your security guy at your company, if you're a smaller company, they really want to be a solution provider and they want to help you. And they're very thankful if you can include them up front early because it makes their job a lot easier in trying to create good, secure solutions to work with your project of designing an SRM solution for your company. Not only that, they're not more than likely not going to be telling you no after the fact, because if they can work with you up front, it's a cheaper solution and there's less rework that has to be done. So I highly recommend you get together with your security team and talk about how you're going to bake security into this SRM solution. So all that's some good background on configuring access control for SRM, but let's see it in action. And the best way to do that is with a demo. In the following demo, we're going to show what the added rules are that SRM has made possible. We're also going to demonstrate and kind of show you around how I've configured some access for a user called SRM Joe, a standard SRM recovery administrator. And we're going to create a custom role just for the purpose of executing a recovery plan. And that would be for a user called VP of Recovery. This would be an executive user that can only initiate a failover. And finally, we'll show you how you can test some of these roles, and I highly recommend you do test any security roles that you create within SRM. Otherwise, what's the point? Okay, with that, let's dive into the demo. All right, it's time to demo SRM access control. First off, we're going to log into one of the Virtual Center sites that has SRM installed on it so we can demonstrate which roles have been added because of SRM. In my case now, I'm logged into the protected site. And at the home screen, what I want you to do is go into roles under administration. This is where we'll see the custom SRM access roles created. The very top here, you'll see the default roles that come with vSphere out of the box. From anything with protection or recovery is now a new role created by SRM. And if we were to take a look at just one of them, I'll go ahead and edit protection groups. You'll see that each one has a pre-configured set of privileges that basically roughly map to what a protection group administrator might be able to need to do in most of the cases. Of course, these out-of-the-box roles aren't going to work for every single use case. You may need to copy them and edit them and tweak as you see fit. We'll go ahead and do that later in this demonstration. Anyway, as we drill down, we can see all the different options that would make up, say, a protection group administrator. We'll cancel that and contrast that with, let's say, the protection VM administrator and edit the role there. You can see quite a different set of privileges. One is only able to do things with virtual machines, and the other is able to do things at a complete protection group level or overall level. There's also recovery administration activities, so part of these roles would only apply to the protected site and part would only apply to the recovery site. In our demonstration and the typical use case that we've been demonstrating overall in this entire instructional video has been one way. We've been going from one protected site to one recovery site. So it's very easy to see where these roles would end up being assigned. In the case of a bidirectional SRM setup, we might need to have recovery roles set up on both sites because there's no longer a one-to-one mapping of recovery to protected, right? A protected site is a recovery site and a recovery site is a protected site. So it's going to be a little messy at that point. So, but we'll keep it very simple for the sake of this demo, and we're still going one way. We have a protected site, we have a recovery site. So that's great. That's the roles that come out of the box. But how do we use them? Well, to demonstrate that, I'm going to actually show you how I've set them up for a user called SRM Joe. All right, so let's take a look at the user account SRM Joe that we had created and map some SRM custom roles to so that we can get a better idea of how this all goes together. To do that, we'll quickly manage the box that we're on and take a look at the users and groups that we have set up. You can see that we have a user called SRM Joe, and if we take a look, SRM Joe is a member of a group. He's a member of SRM admins. Since it's a lot easier in a larger environment to assign permissions to a group and then have many different people inherit the permissions of the group, we're going to go ahead and do that for this demo as well. And all SRM roles will be assigned to this group, SRM admins. So first things first, we do know that in order to administer SRM, you need privilege to be able to log into the Virtual Center with your vSphere client. So let's start there first. To do that, we click on Hosts and Clusters and take a look at the top level because that's what controls access to vSphere. you'll see that we've added the SRM admins user group and we've assigned it the role of read-only. This is the basic floor level permission, let's say, that you need in order to even get access to vSphere to do anything. Additional privileges would then be needed to give you just enough permission within SRM, which we'll dive in and show you that too. If we look at the data center level, we don't have nothing. We don't have anything at the cluster level either. Permissions. But what we do want to show you is at the SRM level. So we'll go into the site recovery plugin and take a look at the root level of site recovery. And you'll see that we've added in the group SRM admins and have assigned it the role of protection SRM administrator. This is going to allow SRM Joe to do the privileges allowed for by the protection SRM administrator role. If we were to look at the properties, we could change this to other roles. However, that's not what we want to do in this demo. Instead, though, let's take a look back and see what SRM Joe actually has rights to do with that role. To do that, go to Home and Roles. And we're looking for SRM Administrator. Let's edit that and just refresh ourselves with what Joe is able to do at the protected site. His only privileges are under Site Recovery Manager. And he has the ability to set advanced settings, configure the array managers, map and remove inventory mappings, and he can create, modify, and remove the remote site. So basically, he can do everything in that setup dialog, but he can't create protection groups. He can't do recovery plans. He's basically a very high-level nuts and bolts guy that would be concerned with the infrastructure, not necessarily the recovery of virtual machines or the protection of them. So you can see how granular we can get at this level. Again, showing you again what SRM Joe probably has access to. He has the ability to connect remote sites. He has the ability to scan for array managers, and he has the ability to map inventory. That's it. Everything else is left up to another administrator. We've also set up Joe with some privileges at the recovery site. So let's take a look at those now. Here we are at the recovery site, and we can see at the recovery VC level, there is the group SRM admins, and we've given that group the recovery inventory administrator right. Let's take a look at what that is, and we can see how it's being applied within the different tree structure of vSphere. We have someone with the virtual machine administrator right at all of these levels, and it's assigned to SRM admins. Very nice graphical view of where that role is being applied. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here to edit the role and show you what it is that this role can do. Under resources, we can assign virtual machines to resource pools. We can modify virtual machines. This is during the recovery. And we can do some of those individual configuration tasks to an individual virtual machine in the event that, let's say, like I described earlier, inventory mappings get changed and a network no longer exists at the recovery site. You'll have to go in and update the placeholder virtual machines manually if you want that to take place. This permission or this role would allow that. Interaction. There's plenty to go here, and we could go and look at all of these privileges, but you get the idea. So we'll cancel this. And of key importance to me is I wanted to show you what it looks like if you're the default administrator. So like right now, we're logged in as administrator. And I can do absolutely everything in SRM that we need to do. That's how we've been configuring this so far. It's easy because, well, it's for demonstration, so we don't have the security needs that you do. But I can do test and I can run a recovery plan. But can SRM Joe test and run a recovery plan? Well, to find that out, what I'd like to do is click at the recovery level and look at the site recovery level. So this is where we can see at a top-down view what permissions have been assigned. And we have SRM admins have been assigned to recovery plans administrator. Let's make sure that Joe is a member of that group first off. We have SRM admins and we have SRM Joe as a member. Great. So we know that SRM Joe should be covered under the recovery plans administrator roles and responsibilities. And as you can see, that permission is propagated down through the tree to cover this critical server recovery plan. Right now, as a default administrator, I can run it. But under recovery plans administrator role, I don't think you can. I'll show you that quick so that you can see for yourself. Recovery plans administrator, and I'll edit that role. And the recovery plan permission is actually under Site Recovery Manager, Recovery Plan, and we have these options: create, modify, remove, run, and test. As you can see, run is unchecked. So, reason would have it that SRM Joe should not be able to run a full-out recovery, although he should be able to test the recovery plan 24/7. Let's test this, making sure we're at recovery site, which we are. I'll open up my vSphere client, and we will log in to that local site, which is the recovery site, as SRM Joe. Okay, now we're logged in as SRM Joe to the recovery site VC. What we'll want to do first is go to site recovery section of the vSphere client. Now I want to drill down to the recovery plan and see what options we have available. Looks like I can test it, but if you look, the run option has been grayed out. So you can see that this proves that the permissions actually work, which is a good thing. Okay, so let's take a look at what you can do to set up a custom SRM role for a very specific purpose. And the purpose that I would like to propose here is that of the actual failover plan, let's say security, and who's allowed to actually run a failover. We would like anyone to be able to test this, or not just anyone, but the people allowed to test it should be able to test it anytime they want without specific approval, let's say. But to actually push that big red button and initiate a failover, that's a C-level decision. That's a major business decision. So let's pretend that we could give access to, let's say, a VP of recovery or VP of disaster recovery to initiate the pushing of the big red button. It's not necessarily a practical way to use SRM security, but I think it'll be a good way to show you what you would have to go through to edit existing roles to solve a specific security requirement for your SRM installation. So with that, let's first start with a group and a user that we want to assign this very specific recovery plan. But first I'll log out of SRM Joe's session and we'll go to Manage Computer to take a look at the users. In my scenario, I'm using local users and groups since I don't have an Active Directory set up for simplicity's sake. If you're doing this within Active Directory, you would obviously be going into Active Directory users and computers to look up users and whatnot. So I've created a new group called Executive Decisions Group. This is a group that only has the privilege to run the recovery plan, nothing else. And within this group, I have created a single user And I've called him VP of Recovery. Him or her. It could be a lady VP of Disaster Recovery. That's fine. Now, our goal here is to be able to have only the run button show up. No testing, no configuration of other VMs, and just enough privilege to execute the run button and then go back to their office and handle executive level communications during a disaster, let's say. So to do that, let's take a look at the roles and see which ones might fit our need the best. In this case, I think I would like to use the Recovery Plans Administrator because I was in there earlier and I could see how that would tie to the execution or the creation or the testing of recovery plans. So we'll edit that role just to make sure. And from what I know, it is under recovery plan. And there you go. Run, remove, modify, create. Sounds like this is where I want to go. I could create from scratch. However, I do like the ability to have these other roles or these other privileges included. Well, I'm going to actually cancel this and let's try it from the beginning. We'll just add a role. So we'll add a role and we'll call it recovery so that it sorts nicely. Executive run button. We'll give it the singular privilege of running a recovery plan. Now, this is where we talked about earlier. We're creating a role this specific without much testing could be an issue, right? You might be able to run the recovery plan, but there might be a whole slew of other privileges that are actually dependent that you actually need to have to function properly to even run the recovery plan. So this may or may not work, but you get the idea of creating a custom role with a specific privilege. So now that the role is created, we need to first make sure the user we want to assign the role can log into vCenter. And to do that, we go to hosts and clusters, as you remember earlier, and I'm going to add a permission. And this will be assigned to that group that we're wanting to assign the role to, which was the executive decisions group. Click OK. And read only is fine. I don't want to propagate to the child objects though, because that would allow them to read all of the inventory, and we don't want the executives to be able to see all that complexity. We want to keep it very simple. So we'll click OK, and they now have the ability to log in. Anyone in that group has the ability to log in to vCenter. They can't do much yet though, because we haven't given any other roles. So to do that, let's go to the site recovery section so that we can apply our new role that we've created. To do that, click on the site recovery at the tree, go to permissions tab, click add permission, which I got to that dialog by right clicking in the white space. We'll go ahead and click add to add the executive decisions group. Double click and OK. Now we should have a role in here that we've created, and it should sort nicely under recovery. And there it is at the very bottom, recovery executive run button. And I'll go ahead and propagate that to child objects. That's fine. We could probably create it just at the recovery level, but since this is just for the sake of demonstration, we'll leave it as is and click OK. Great. So if I select the critical recovery plan and take a look at the users and groups assigned to it, administrators are assigned, SRM admins are assigned and have a certain role. Executive decisions group has the role that we just created, which should allow them to click the run button. So let's test this out with the user that we added to that group, called VP of Recovery. We're logged in as VP of Recovery. You can see that there's not much there. It's just a recovery center VC. No read-only permissions on anything contained within it. No virtual machines, no hosts, no nothing. We can see tasks and events. But what we wanted to do is take a look at site recovery and see if it can see the recovery plan. Okay, we're at the site recovery page here. We logged in as VP of recovery, and you can see that there's no protection groups over there. That's fine. But I can see a recovery plan, and I try to edit that, and that's all grayed out. So I can see that those options aren't available. I can't test it, pause it, resume it, stop it. But hey, guess what? The run button is there. So it is possible that you could create a custom role to lock down a executive so that they can't see anything else, but they could come in here in the event of a disaster and run the failover. Whether it would work or not, unattended with only executive behind the wheel, that's for you to test. But more than likely, we would have a team of people with their individual permissions logged in through their vSphere clients, being able to monitor this process the whole way. So that kind of does it for showing you what's possible with access roles in SRM and the different options you have to create your own or just assign the out-of-the-box SRM roles, and at what levels you need to do that so that the appropriate permission is given to the right resources at the right level. And we also touched on the fact that don't forget to give at least read-only permission at the virtual center level so that SRM users can actually log into VC to do what they need to do within SRM. That would usually only apply to your larger orgs where there's a specific SRM group that maybe isn't familiar with the day-to-day administration of SRM. Smaller organizations probably would have the same users doing the VMware administration doing the SRM, so you might not have a need for this level of access role, but it's good to know that it's there in case you do. And as always, don't forget to test. In a disaster recovery scenario, you don't want to have to test roles for the very first time. You want to make sure that the roles that you've created or used behave as you would expect, especially when it comes to restoring your business and restoring your livelihood and the livelihood of the others working with you. So with that, thanks, and we'll get back to the rest of this lesson. All right, let's talk about SRM logs. In your configuration of SRM and the ongoing administration, things might not always go according to plan, and Murphy's Law will happen. That's where logging is helpful to help you resolve and troubleshoot issues that you have with your environment. To find the logs for Site Recovery Manager, you'll simply need to go to the following directory location: See Documents and Settings, All Users, Application Data, VMware, VMware vCenter Site Recovery Manager, and inside of that is a logs directory. In this will be a listing of the last couple of logs, and you can go to the latest and greatest by looking at the earliest, or actually the latest date. I like to find that log, go straight to the bottom and see what was happening right when I had an error. And you can usually figure out the parts of the log that are affecting you within a short period of time. That being said, the level of detail in there isn't necessarily the easiest for humans to read, and hopefully it could get more descriptive in the future. But it's the best available low-level tool that you have today for that type of troubleshooting. Sometimes you'll get into issues that you can't solve through your own powers of deduction or with the help of the communities or Twitter, and it's time to pull out the big guns at that point. And you'll call VMware support, and they would probably ask or request that you generate a log bundle. It's good practice to maybe know where this is in advance so that you can create it ahead of time and have it ready to submit right away. To find that, you can browse out to the script and run that script from the location here, or you can go to Start Programs and actually get to it through the Windows Start menu. which we'll show that later in the demo. This will contain a little bit more than just logs. It will also contain the configuration files for SRM, any core dumps if they happen to exist, as well as the entire log directory, not just the latest log. So they'll be able to see over time what was happening if they need to go back a couple days of logs. With that, let's go ahead and jump into the demo for showing you how you can generate SRM logs and where they're located. Okay, we're logged into the recovery site right now, although you could be logged into the protected site, it doesn't matter. And we're trying to generate some logs to be used for troubleshooting. If we look in the interface, there really isn't a place to go to grab the SRM logs specifically, but I will show you where you can browse out to find them. If you pull up Windows Explorer, you can actually head out to the C drive, and if you go to Documents and Settings, All Users, Application Data, VMware vCenter Site Recovery Manager, there'll be a folder called Logs. Go ahead and open Logs, and it will actually reveal here the latest and greatest log, which is this VMware-DR-41, and the zipped up logs from previous weeks and days. What I like to do is take a copy of the latest log and paste it right in that directory so I'm not editing any live files. And you can open that with Notepad. Lots of detailed information, not all of it necessarily easy to read. Where I like to go is straight to the bottom because it is in time order, so the latest and greatest stuff will be recorded here at the bottom. And if you had an error, you'd be able to see what was happening at that time. So that would be useful for your day-to-day troubleshooting of issues. However, if you needed to call VMware support and create a more complete log bundle, what you'd want to do is go to Start, All Programs, VMware, and there's a VMware vCenter Site Recovery Manager option. Inside of that is an option to generate a log bundle for Site Recovery Manager. We'll go ahead and click that. Zips through the log, and when you're done, it gives you a helpful message saying, yep, we're complete, and this is where you can find us. So I'm going to go ahead and find that location. It looks like it just threw it onto my desktop, so that should be easy. Yep, there's the only zip file I have on my desktop. I'll go ahead and open that so you can see what's inside. Just like I said earlier, we have three folders. One's a config folder, which contains configuration information on SRM, which can be useful for VMware support to troubleshoot. Could contain core dumps if SRM server is running into issues where it's locking up and having to dump memory. And the logs directory, which that should look familiar. So if there's things you don't want being shipped off to VMware support in that directory, you might want to clean them up before you create that log bundle. That's really all there is to logging with Site Recovery Manager. Fairly simple, straightforward tool so far. Hopefully it continues to expand as the product gets bigger. Most importantly in the area of descriptiveness for errors so that it's easier to pinpoint configuration issues as you're setting it up. Okay, it's time for us to cover recovery plan reporting. Recovery plan reports can be exported for each recovery plan. This is an easy way to document your SRM setup. Recovery plan test history can also be reported. This will show the success or failure of the planned steps that are executed during a recovery or recovery test. There's quite a few use cases for both types of reporting. The first is most obvious, updating documentation for your disaster recovery runbook. It's a great way to keep that thing current, up to date with the latest information. Also, documenting the success or failure of DR tests, which can help you improve or perfect those disaster recovery tests. In the past, in like a physical server environment for disaster recovery, if you're having to update that runbook, it was kind of a laborious process, right? You have to find the actual paper, you have to reprint these things. It's kind of messy. In the case of SRM, you'll find areas where you might need to tweak the configuration a little bit, whether it's inventory mappings or the order of recovery. Once you change that order within SRM, you can just click on the button to export a new report, and it's self-documenting. So it's a real good reason for SRM, and it's a good feature you want to make sure you take care of rather than documenting this by hand. Also, compliance reporting is a good use of this feature in that you can completely automate the process of creating reports on your DR tests, and you could probably present them without much editing, although you'd probably want to make them part of a larger report. But you can just hand that report to auditors or executives and prove that you're doing testing, and you can instantly see the success or failure of those tests that you're doing. This is really a good use case for the financial industry and even small community banks that are setting up virtual machine environments at two different sites. They can use SRM between the two and do testing on a regular basis and print out this report. So when they have to pass their FDIC audits, here you go, a lot easier. There's also a couple of different file formats that are supported with this export feature. You can export to the Microsoft XLS format or Excel. It supports Word docs, CSV. HTML is the default, and it's the one most typically used, and you can also use XML. So with those different file formats, it opens up your ability to automate the document creation even further. So maybe you could transfer that XLS or that XML into a completely different document that could have its own custom formatting to meet your needs. With that, let's go ahead and try a little demo of the recovery plan reporting. All right, here we are logged into the recovery site, and quick check here, local site says recovery, so you know that's where we're at. And what I want to do is highlight the recovery plan that we have set up. The first option for exporting this is contained right here at the second icon. It says Export Recovery Plan. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And you can choose a location. I'm going to store this in My Documents and give it the name of Critical Server Recovery Plan Report. Click Save. You created that document, and it actually launches the browser so you can view it right away. Great way to detail exactly what you saw in the steps for that recovery plan. Shut down VMs, prepare storage. If we switch back to this, it says shut down VMs, prepare storage. It's everything in order. Great way to document your SRM environment. And if we go out to My Documents, you'll see that I have an HTML file out there. Great. So that's cool. But what about reporting on testing? To find that, you can go to the History tab and see a list of the tests that you've done in the past. I've done one earlier tonight, so you should be able to get some information on that. Over to the right, you'll see two options. We can view the steps that happened as part of the recovery test, or we can actually export. I'll do view first to show you what that does. Basically, it just pulls it up into a browser, and you could save this out if you wanted to, but this looks very familiar, right? Except it's added in some additional information to show the success or failure or any other notifications that need to happen of what happened during the recovery test and how long it took. So I'll close that. I want to actually export this because I'd like to give it to some auditors that are coming in to see our test lab environment. And for giggles, let's make it into a CSV format. Critical server recovery plan. Second quarter test. And I want to do a CSV just to show you that that can be done. Once you get the file name in, click Save, and it opens it up in Notepad. Although you could copy this out and view in Excel if you needed to and edit. Basically the same information that would have been presented in HTML is now in CSV. So if you had scripts that could parse this and format it however you want and put it into another document format, you could leverage that and automate your DR reporting requirements. Well, that does it for this lesson on administering SRM. But before we go, let's review what we've learned in this lesson. First, we learned how to administer protection groups and the protected VMs. Specifically, we learned how to use VMware migration techniques to control which virtual machines get protected and which don't. We also discussed how to configure or remove protection on those virtual machines once they've been moved from the appropriate data store. We showed you protected data store administration and how to add new protected data stores to expand capacity and some of the tricks needed to allow SRM to see these new replicated volumes, which basically meant adding a virtual machine to that newly replicated data store. We also covered how to adjust inventory mappings and troubleshoot issues related to incomplete mappings of virtual resources. We created and managed SRM alarms to keep a better handle on the configuration management of your SRM configuration. We addressed how to configure access control on your SRM servers, and we politely reminded you to get your security team involved early to help with this configuration. We overviewed SRM logging and how to use this information to troubleshoot issues or to help file logging with VMware support. And finally, we showed you how you can use the recovery plan reporting to keep DR documentation updated and your auditors surprisingly happy. And that concludes this lesson on administering SRM. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.